The dust swirled thick in the town square that September morning, kicked up by restless boots and the nervous shuffling of horses tied to weathered hitching posts. Eliza McKinley stood with her arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters, feeling the weight of curious stares pressing against them like the oppressive heat radiating from the sun-baked earth beneath their feet. At 19, she had learned to carry burdens too heavy for her slender shoulders, but nothing had prepared her for this moment when Uncle Silas would auction them off like livestock to pay his gambling debts. Mary, 16 and delicate as a pressed flower, trembled against her side while 14-year-old Sarah gripped Eliza's worn calico skirt with white knuckles. The youngest still carried traces of childhood defiance in her green eyes, though 3 years under their uncle's cruel roof had dimmed much of her natural spirit. Eliza smoothed Sarah's tangled auburn hair with gentle fingers. Whispering words of comfort, she barely believed herself as the crowd of potential buyers gathered in a loose circle around the makeshift platform Uncle Silas had constructed from old crates and barn wood. The auctioneer, a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice like grinding gravel, climbed onto the platform and cleared his throat with theatrical importance. "Ladies work hard," he announced to the assembled crowd, gesturing toward the 3 sisters with a sweep of his arm that made Eliza's stomach turn. "Experienced in household duties, cooking, and general farm work. Sold as a group to ensure proper care and supervision." The words fell like stones into the morning air, each one another weight added to the crushing reality of their situation. As I share this story with you today, I find myself wondering about the connections that span across time and distance. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time of day is it in your corner of the earth? There's something beautiful about how stories can bring us together, no matter the miles between us or the hours that separate our daily rhythms. Jonas McKenna stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set in a hard line that had become his permanent expression since losing his wife 2 years prior. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had built something substantial from nothing. His cattle ranch sprawling across thousands of acres of prime grazing land 20 miles south of town. He had not come to the auction seeking human companionship or household help, but rather to purchase a new plow horse advertised in the weekly newspaper. The sight of 3 young women being offered for sale like farm equipment stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a mixture of disgust and protective anger he had not felt since the war. Uncle Silas, a man whose weak chin and shifty eyes betrayed his moral character as clearly as his tattered coat revealed his financial circumstances, stepped forward with an oily smile that made Jonas want to reach for the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "These girls come from good stock," Silas declared, his voice carrying across the square with practiced ease. "Their parents, God rest their souls, were fine Christian folk who raised them proper. They know their way around a kitchen and can work a garden better than most full-grown women." The lie rolled off his tongue as easily as water off a duck's back, for Jonas could see the fear and exhaustion etched into each young face, the telltale signs of mistreatment that no amount of false advertising could conceal. The bidding began at $50 for all 3, a sum so insultingly low that Jonas felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. A local shopkeeper raised his hand first, followed by a farmer from the next county who needed help with his expanding brood of children. Each bid felt like a blade twisting deeper into Eliza's heart as she watched strangers evaluate them with the cold calculation reserved for purchasing livestock. She tried to stand straighter, to project strength and capability that might ensure they would not be separated, though her legs trembled beneath her worn woolen skirt. When the bidding reached $75, Jonas surprised himself by raising his hand. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with renewed enthusiasm as he recognized the rancher's substantial reputation in the community. "Do I hear 80? The man called out, his voice rising with the scent of a profitable sale. $80 from the gentleman in the black hat. Jonas had not intended to participate in this degrading spectacle, yet something in the eldest girl's protective stance over her sisters reminded him of his late wife's fierce loyalty to those she loved. The shopkeeper dropped out at $90, unwilling to invest such a sum in household help when his own business struggled to turn a profit. The farmer continued bidding with grim determination until the price reached $120, at which point he shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. Jonas found himself the sole remaining bidder, facing 3 pairs of frightened eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror at their uncertain future. $120 going once, the auctioneer announced, his hammer raised above his head like an executioner's axe. Sarah broke free from her sister's protective embrace and took a stumbling step toward Jonas. Her young face streaked with tears she had tried so hard to contain. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "Please don't let him split us up. We promise to work real hard for you. We won't cause no trouble at all." Her desperate plea cut through Jonas like a hot knife, reminding him of his own sister's final words before consumption claimed her life during his childhood. The hammer fell with a sound like breaking bones, sealing their fate and binding 3 young lives to a man they had never met. Jonas walked forward with heavy steps to complete the transaction, counting out the bills from his leather wallet, while Uncle Silas practically salivated at the sight of ready cash. The sisters huddled together like frightened deer, unsure whether they had been rescued or simply traded to a different form of captivity. As Jonas approached them with his payment completed, Eliza raised her chin with as much dignity as she could muster and met his steady gaze with her own, searching his weathered features for some sign of the treatment they might expect in their new home. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm against the rutted dirt road as Jonas guided his team of horses away from town and toward the rolling hills that marked the boundary of his ranch. The 3 sisters sat huddled together in the wagon bed among sacks of grain and supplies, their few possessions clutched in a single carpet bag that had seen better days. Eliza kept her arms wrapped around Mary and Sarah, creating a protective barrier against both the bouncing motion of the wagon and the uncertain future that lay ahead of them. Jonas had not spoken a word since completing the transaction with their uncle, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his worn leather vest as he focused on the road ahead. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, filled with unasked questions and unspoken fears. Sarah, who had always been the boldest of the 3 despite her young age, finally worked up the courage to speak. "Mister," she called out hesitantly, her voice barely audible above the wagon noise. "What kind of work will we be doing for you?" The rancher's hands tightened on the reins, and for a moment Eliza feared he might be the kind of man who expected complete silence from those under his authority. When he finally responded, his voice carried a gruff gentleness that surprised them all. "You'll help with the house and the cooking," he said without turning around. "Nothing you haven't done before, I expect. The ranch is big, but it's just me and a few hands who mostly take care of themselves." Mary pressed closer to Eliza's side, her artistic soul already taking in the landscape around them despite her fear. The rolling grasslands stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with cattle that grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Wildflowers painted splashes of purple and yellow across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents. It was beautiful in a way that their cramped existence in town had never been, though beauty meant little when you did not know if you were safe. As we travel together through this story, I'm curious about your own journey today. Are you listening from a bustling city or somewhere quiet like this prairie landscape? Whether it's morning coffee time or late evening, wherever you are, I love knowing that these characters' story is reaching you across the miles. The ranch buildings came into view as they crested a small hill, and all 3 sisters caught their breath at the sight. Jonas had built something impressive from the raw frontier, with a large main house constructed of solid timber and stone, a massive barn that could shelter dozens of animals, and several smaller outbuildings arranged in a practical pattern around a central courtyard. Split-rail fences marked the boundaries of corrals and pastures, and a windmill turned lazily near a well-tended vegetable garden that showed signs of recent neglect. "This is home," Jonas announced simply as he pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch of the main house. The sisters climbed down carefully, their legs stiff from the long ride and their hearts pounding with nervous anticipation. The house rose before them like a fortress, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun, and its wide porch offering promise of shade and shelter. Eliza had expected something crude and temporary, the kind of rough cabin that most frontier men called home, but this structure spoke of permanence and careful planning. Jonas carried their single bag to the porch steps and set it down with awkward gentleness, as if handling something precious and fragile. He gestured toward the front door with emotion that seemed more invitation than command. "Come on then," he said, his voice softer than before. "Let me show you where you'll be staying." The interior of the house proved even more impressive than its exterior, with solid furniture crafted from local timber and evidence of a woman's touch in the carefully chosen curtains, and the remains of a flower garden visible through the kitchen window. "Your wife has a lovely home," Eliza ventured carefully, hoping to break through the wall of silence that surrounded their new employer. Jonas stopped abruptly, his shoulders tensing with remembered pain, and for a long moment he did not respond. She did, he finally answered, his voice barely above a whisper. She died 2 years back. Been trying to keep things running the way she would have wanted, but I'm not much good at the finer details. The admission hung in the air between them, revealing a vulnerability that none of them had expected from the stern-faced rancher who had purchased them at auction. Sarah, with the intuitive compassion of youth, stepped forward and placed her small hand on his arm. "We're real sorry for your loss, mister," she said softly. "We know what it's like to lose someone important. Our parents died in the fever 3 years ago, and we've been missing them every day since." Jonas looked down at the young girl's earnest face and felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from further loss. He cleared his throat roughly and nodded toward the staircase that led to the second floor. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," he managed to say. "You can each have your own, or share if you prefer. Whatever makes you most comfortable." The offer of privacy and choice was so unexpected that all 3 sisters exchanged glances of surprise and cautious hope. Dawn broke over the McKenna ranch with the soft golden light that painted the prairie grass in shades of amber and copper, and for the first time in 3 years, Eliza woke without the immediate stab of fear that had greeted each morning under Uncle Silas's roof. She had chosen to share the largest bedroom with her sisters, unable to bear the thought of separation after so many nights huddled together for protection and comfort. Mary stirred beside her, blinking sleepily at the unfamiliar surroundings, while Sarah sat curled by the window, watching the sunrise paint colors across the endless sky. The house felt different in the morning light, less imposing and more welcoming than it had seemed the previous evening. Sunlight streamed through clean windows onto polished wooden floors, and the gentle sounds of cattle lowing in the distance created a peaceful backdrop that was foreign to their experience. Eliza rose quietly and smoothed her wrinkled dress, knowing that their first day would set the tone for everything that followed. They needed to prove their worth, to show Jonas McKenna that his investment in them had been sound. Downstairs, they found the kitchen already warmed by a fire in the great stone hearth, though Jonas was nowhere to be seen. A note scrawled in masculine handwriting lay propped against a coffee tin on the wooden table. "Gone to check the south pasture. Help yourselves to whatever you need. Coffee's in the tin, eggs in the henhouse out back." The simple courtesy of the message surprised Eliza, who had expected orders and demands rather than invitation and consideration. Sarah, ever the explorer despite their uncertain circumstances, pushed open the back door to reveal a vista that took their breath away. The ranch spread before them like a kingdom carved from the raw wilderness, with pastures stretching to the horizon and the mountains rising like purple sentinels in the distance. A vegetable garden lay neglected near the house, its raised beds choked with weeds but still showing signs of careful planning and rich soil beneath the overgrowth. Mary knelt beside a row of what had once been tomato plants, her artist's eye seeing potential beneath the wilderness of untended growth. "This could be beautiful again," she murmured, running her fingers through the dark earth. "Someone loved this garden once. They planted it with such care." The longing in her voice spoke of her own need to create beauty, to nurture something living and growing after years of existing under the shadow of their uncle's cruelty. Eliza found the henhouse exactly where Jonas had indicated, a sturdy structure that housed a dozen fat hens who regarded her with suspicious curiosity. The eggs lay warm and brown in their nests, more wealth and protein than the sisters had seen in months of meager meals under Uncle Silas's grudging care. She gathered them carefully in her skirt, marveling at the abundance that surrounded them in this place that Jonas McKenna called home. When they returned to the kitchen with their harvest of eggs and the first vegetables salvaged from the neglected garden, the sisters fell into the familiar rhythm of meal preparation that had sustained them through the darkest days of their recent past. Eliza mixed batter for flapjacks while Mary cleaned the vegetables with careful attention to detail, and Sarah set the table with the care befitting fine china, though the plates were simple pottery glazed in blue and white. The sound of horses approaching brought them all to the window, where they watched Jonas ride into the yard accompanied by 2 ranch hands whose weathered faces spoke of years spent under the prairie sun. The men dismounted with the easy grace of those born to the saddle, and Jonas paused to speak with them in low tones before heading toward the house. His step on the porch was firm but not heavy, and he knocked gently on his own door as if seeking permission to enter his own home. "Come in," Eliza called, suddenly nervous about their presumption in taking over his kitchen. Jonas stepped through the doorway and stopped short at the sight that greeted him. The table was set for 4 with careful attention to placement and proportion, wildflowers from the prairie arranged in a mason jar as a centerpiece, and the aroma of coffee and cooking food filled the air with warmth and welcome. For a moment, something flickered across his weathered features that might have been pain or gratitude or both. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said quietly, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His dark hair was flattened where the hat had rested, and dust from the morning ride streaked his boots and the legs of his worn denim pants. "But it's been a long time since this house smelled like home, and I'm grateful for it." Sarah beamed at the praise, her natural enthusiasm breaking through the careful reserve she had maintained since their arrival. "We found eggs in your henhouse and some vegetables that were still good in the garden," she announced proudly. "Mary thinks she can bring the garden back to life if you'll let her work on it. She's got a gift for growing things." Jonas looked at Mary, who blushed under his attention but met his gaze with quiet determination. "I'd like that," he said simply. "My wife planted that garden, and I haven't had the heart to tend it proper since she passed. If you can bring it back, you'd be doing me a kindness I don't know how to repay." The admission of his vulnerability in the face of grief made him seem less intimidating and more human, a man carrying his own burden of loss and longing. The third week at the McKenna Ranch brought an early autumn chill that reminded the sisters of the approaching winter and the fragile nature of their newfound security. Eliza had fallen into a routine of rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for Jonas and his hands, finding satisfaction in the simple act of providing nourishment for those who worked the land with such dedication. The kitchen had become her domain, and she took pride in the way Jonas's eyes softened when he entered each morning to find fresh coffee waiting and the smell of bacon filling the warm air. Mary had indeed worked magic with the neglected garden, spending hours each day coaxing life back into the abandoned beds. Her hands, once soft from their previous sheltered life, had grown strong and capable as she pulled weeds and turned soil that had been packed hard by neglect. The tomato plants responded to her care with new growth, and the herb garden began to show the green shoots of recovery. Jonas often paused in his work to watch her from a distance, something approaching wonder in his expression as he witnessed the resurrection of his late wife's beloved sanctuary. Sarah had appointed herself guardian of the henhouse and had developed individual relationships with each of the dozen birds under her care. She named them all and spoke to them with the easy confidence of childhood, gathering eggs each morning with the solemnity of one entrusted with important responsibility. The hens seemed to respond to her gentle nature, producing more eggs than Jonas could remember collecting in years past, as if they too were thriving under the care of someone who saw them as more than mere livestock. But it was during the quiet evening hours, when the work was done and they gathered around the kitchen table for supper, that the deeper wounds began to show themselves. A sudden loud noise would cause all three sisters to flinch involuntarily, their bodies remembering the sound of Uncle Silas's heavy hand against whatever surface had earned his drunken wrath. Sarah, despite her apparent resilience, still woke some nights with muffled cries that brought her sisters rushing to comfort her, their whispered reassurances carrying the weight of shared trauma. Jonas began to understand the depth of their suffering through these small revelations, each involuntary reaction painting a clearer picture of the hell from which he had unknowingly rescued them. The way Eliza always positioned herself between him and her younger sisters, the way Mary's hands trembled when he spoke sharply to one of the ranch hands within her hearing, the way Sarah's bright chatter would stop abruptly if his voice carried even the faintest edge of irritation. They had learned to read the moods of dangerous men, and despite his gentle treatment of them, they could not yet trust that his kindness would endure. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, Sarah's careful composure finally cracked. She had been helping Eliza clear the supper dishes when a plate slipped from her hands and shattered against the stone floor with a sound like breaking bones. The crash seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and Sarah stood frozen among the scattered pieces, her face white with terror and her small body braced for the blow she had learned to expect from such accidents. Jonas, who had been reading a week-old newspaper by the fire, looked up at the sound and saw the child's panic with clarity that cut him to the bone. "It's just a plate, Sarah," he said quietly, setting aside his paper and rising from his chair with deliberate slowness. "Accidents happen to everyone. No harm done." But Sarah had already begun to shake, the careful control she had maintained for weeks dissolving under the weight of expectation and remembered pain. "Uncle Silas would have whipped us for breaking his things," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "He said we were clumsy and worthless and that every mistake we made cost him money he didn't have." He made us go to bed without supper if we broke anything, even by accident. The words tumbled out in a rush, as if a dam had burst and could no longer contain the flood of hurt that had been building behind her brave facade. Eliza moved swiftly to gather her youngest sister into protective arms, but Jonas was already kneeling among the broken pottery, his large hands carefully collecting the sharp pieces while his voice remained steady and calm. "Your uncle was wrong about you, Sarah," he said without looking up from his task. "You're not clumsy or worthless. You're a good girl who's been through more than any child should have to bear. This old plate has been cracked for months anyway. Probably did me a favor by finally giving up the ghost." Mary appeared with a broom and dustpan, her movements quick and efficient as she helped clear away the remnants of the accident. The three of them worked together in companionable silence while Sarah watched from the safety of Eliza's embrace, gradually understanding that no punishment would follow. No angry words or raised hands would mark this moment of human frailty. When the floor was clean and the fragments disposed of, Jonas returned to his chair by the fire and gestured for them to join him in the circle of warmth and light. "I think it's time you knew something about why I bought you at that auction," he said, his weathered hands clasped together as he stared into the dancing flames. The sisters settled near the hearth, Sarah still close enough to Eliza to feel the comfort of her protective presence. "I didn't go to town that day looking for household help or company. I went to buy a plow horse and mind my own business. But when I saw you three standing there, looking so scared and trying so hard to be brave, you reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten." The firelight danced across Jonas's weathered features as he gathered the courage to share memories he had kept locked away since his wife's death. "I had a sister once," he began, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "Her name was Rebecca, and she was about Sarah's age when our parents died in a wagon accident. I was barely 16 myself, but I became responsible for her care overnight. We had no other family, no one who wanted the burden of two orphan children." The sisters leaned forward instinctively, recognizing the familiar pain of loss and abandonment in his words. Sarah had stopped trembling and now sat with her small hands folded in her lap, her green eyes fixed on Jonas's face with the intensity of someone who understood that shared stories could heal wounds that silence only deepened. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy around their small circle by the fire. "We ended up in a workhouse in St. Louis," Jonas continued, his gaze distant as he relived those harsh years. "Rebecca was so small and delicate, like Mary here, and she had the same way of finding beauty in the ugliest places. She would make little flowers out of scraps of fabric and hide them under her pillow so the matrons wouldn't throw them away. Said they reminded her of our mother's garden back home." The parallel to Mary's resurrection of his wife's abandoned garden was not lost on any of them, and Mary felt tears prick her eyes at the recognition of kinship across time and circumstance. "The workhouse was no place for children," Jonas said, his jaw tightening with remembered anger. "The people who ran it saw us as free labor, nothing more. Rebecca got sick that first winter, a cough that wouldn't go away, and they wouldn't spare the money for a doctor. Said she was malingering, trying to get out of her duties. I begged them to let me take her to town, promised I would work double shifts to pay for the medicine, but they refused. Said it would set a bad precedent if they coddled every child who claimed to be ill." As Jonas shares this painful memory with us, I'm thinking about how stories like these connect us all, regardless of where we come from. Whether you're listening from a cozy home on a rainy evening like this one, or perhaps starting your day with morning sunlight where you are, these moments of human connection transcend the boundaries of time and place. I'd love to know what part of the world you're in right now as we journey through this story together. Eliza reached across the space between them and placed her hand gently on Jonas's arm, offering the same comfort that Sarah had given him weeks earlier. The gesture seemed to steady him, and he continued with his story, though his voice remained thick with emotion. "Rebecca died that spring, just before her 15th birthday. I held her hand while she slipped away, and I promised her that if I ever had the chance to help other children who were alone and scared, I would do whatever it took to protect them. That promise has haunted me for 20 years. Sarah slipped from her sister's side and moved to kneel beside Jonas's chair, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. "That's why you saved us," she whispered. "Because of Rebecca. Because you couldn't save her, but you could save us." The simple truth of her words hung in the air between them, and Jonas nodded slowly, unable to trust his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. Mary rose from her place by the fire and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a small bundle wrapped in one of the clean dish towels Eliza had washed that morning. She placed it carefully in Jonas's hands, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and hope. "I made something for you," she said softly. "I found some wildflowers that were still blooming despite the cold, and I pressed them between the pages of an old book I found. I thought maybe you might like to have something beautiful to remember Rebecca by." Jonas unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers to reveal a small wooden frame that Mary had crafted from scraps found in the barn workshop. Inside, arranged with an artist's eye for color and composition, lay a collection of prairie wildflowers pressed between thin sheets of glass. Purple asters and golden blackeyed Susans created a miniature garden that captured the essence of the vast landscape surrounding them. And in the corner, written in Mary's careful script, were the words in memory of Rebecca McKenna, who found beauty in the darkest places. The gift broke something open in Jonas's chest that had been sealed tight since his wife's death, and tears he had not allowed himself to shed in 2 years spilled down his weathered cheeks. He pulled Mary into a gentle embrace, then opened his arms to include Sarah and finally Eliza, gathering all 3 sisters into the circle of his protection and gratitude. "You are not servants in this house," he said fiercely. "You are family. Whatever happens, whatever challenges we face them together." Outside, the rain continued to fall on the prairie grass and the carefully tended garden, washing the earth clean and preparing it for new growth. Inside the warm kitchen, 4 wounded souls had found something precious in their shared pain, a foundation of understanding upon which they could build a future none of them had dared to imagine. The broken plate lay forgotten in the waste bin, replaced by something far more valuable and infinitely more fragile. The beginning of trust, and the promise of belonging that had been missing from all their lives for far too long. October brought the first hard frost to the McKenna ranch, painting the windows with delicate patterns of ice and turning the prairie grass into a sea of golden stubble that rustled in the morning wind. The sisters had settled into their new life with a contentment that seemed almost too precious to trust, each day bringing small confirmations that their safety was real and enduring. Mary's garden had produced a final harvest of late vegetables that now filled the root cellar with the promise of winter sustenance, while Sarah's chickens had grown fat and productive under her devoted care. Eliza had begun to lose the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes since their parents' death, her shoulders no longer permanently braced for the next blow or harsh word. She moved through the house with quiet confidence, managing the domestic sphere with the efficiency of someone who had found purpose in caring for those she loved. Jonas had grown to depend on her steady presence, the way she anticipated his needs without being asked and created order from the chaos of ranch life with gentle authority. The peaceful rhythm of their days was shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when the sound of approaching horses brought Jonas to the window with a frown creasing his weathered brow. 3 riders approached the house at a deliberate pace, and even from a distance he could see the calculating expression on the face of the man in the lead. Uncle Silas had returned, flanked by 2 companions whose hard faces and worn gun belts marked them as the kind of men who sold their services to whoever could meet their price. Jonas moved swiftly to the kitchen where the sisters were preparing the noon meal, his urgent manner immediately alerting them to danger. Eliza took one look at his grim expression and felt her stomach clench with familiar terror. Sarah dropped the eggs she had been gathering into a bowl, her hands shaking as the old fears came rushing back with the force of a winter storm. Mary pressed herself against the wall, her artist's sensitivity picking up the tension that suddenly filled the air like electricity before lightning strikes. "Your uncle is here," Jonas said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the grip of his revolver. "He's brought friends with him, and I doubt they've come for a social visit. I want you all to go upstairs and stay there until this is finished. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, don't come down until I call for you." The protective authority in his voice was absolute, but Eliza shook her head with desperate determination. "We won't hide while you face him alone," she said, though her voice trembled with the effort of defying the man who had become their sanctuary. "He's our burden to bear, not yours. If he wants us back, he'll have to take us himself." But Jonas was already moving toward the front door, his movements carrying the controlled violence of a man who had learned to fight during the war and had never forgotten the lessons blood and gunpowder had taught him. "You are my family now," he said without turning back, "and I protect what's mine." The possessive declaration sent both warmth and terror through Eliza's heart, for she recognized the dangerous edge in his voice that spoke of a man pushed beyond the limits of his patience. The sisters retreated to the staircase but remained within earshot, unable to abandon Jonas entirely even though their presence might complicate whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Uncle Silas dismounted with the swagger of a man who believed himself to hold all the advantages, his companions flanking him as he approached the porch with deliberate insolence. His clothes were finer than they had been at the auction, paid for with the money Jonas had given him, and his manner carried the artificial confidence of someone who had recently come into unexpected fortune. The contrast between his improved circumstances and the suffering he had caused his nieces filled Jonas with a cold rage that settled in his bones like winter frost. "McKenna," Silas called out in greeting, his voice carrying false joviality that fooled no one. "I've come to discuss a business matter with you. Seems there was a misunderstanding about the terms of our previous transaction. My nieces were only meant to be hired help, not permanent acquisitions. I'm prepared to return your money and take them back where they belong." Jonas stepped onto the porch with measured steps, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was anything but casual. The afternoon sun caught the metal of his badge, a detail that had not been visible during the auction but now gleamed with official authority. As it happened, Jonas had served as a deputy sheriff for the county during the previous year, a position he had accepted reluctantly but maintained out of civic duty. "There was no misunderstanding, Silas," Jonas replied, his voice carrying the flat coldness of prairie winter. "I paid fair price at a legal auction for 3 workers, and the transaction was witnessed by half the town. They're under my protection now, and they're not going anywhere." The sisters, listening from the staircase, felt their hearts leap with desperate hope even as terror continued to claw at their throats. One of Silas's companions, a lean man with dead eyes and quick hands, shifted restlessly in his saddle and spat tobacco juice into the dirt near the porch steps. "Seems to me a man's family ought to be with their blood kin," he drawled, his meaning clear despite the casual tone. "Might be we need to help you see reason about what's right and proper." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, and Jonas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had preceded every battle he had fought in the war. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring between the two groups of men, Jonas standing alone on his porch while Silas and his hired guns remained mounted, using their elevated position to project dominance and threat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called with innocent beauty that seemed to mock the ugly confrontation unfolding beneath the vast prairie sky. Jonas could feel the weight of the sisters' presence on the staircase behind him, their fear a palpable force that strengthened his resolve even as it complicated the delicate balance of the situation. Silas dismounted with theatrical slowness, his boots hitting the packed earth with deliberate emphasis as he approached the porch steps. His face wore the expression of a man who believed himself to hold all the winning cards, though Jonas could see the nervous sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. Behind him, his 2 companions remained in their saddles but shifted their positions to better cover the approaches to the house, their movements carrying the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to violence. "Now Jonas," Silas said with false reasonableness, "let's be civilized about this. Those girls have been in my care since their parents died, and it's not right for them to be living unmarried in a house with a single man. People talk, reputations get damaged. Might be better for everyone if they came back to town where proper Christian folks can keep an eye on their moral development." The hypocrisy of his words was staggering, coming from a man who had sold his own nieces like livestock to pay gambling debts. Jonas felt his jaw clench with the effort of controlling his temper, but his voice remained steady and cold when he replied, "Their reputation is safe enough under my roof, Silas. Safer than it ever was under yours, from what I've observed. The law says a man who pays fair price at public auction has clear title to what he's bought, and I intend to stand on that law. The sisters stay where they are, and that's final." As this confrontation unfolds on the ranch, I find myself thinking about the power of chosen family and the courage it takes to protect those we love. Whether you're listening to this story during a peaceful morning or perhaps a quiet evening wherever you are in the world, I hope you're surrounded by people who would stand up for you the way Jonas is standing up for these sisters. What time is it in your corner of the world right now, and do you have someone in your life who represents that kind of unwavering protection? The lean gunman with the dead eyes nudged his horse forward a few steps, his hand resting with casual menace on the butt of his revolver. "Seems to me the law can be interpreted different ways depending on who's doing the interpreting," he said with a cold smile that never reached his eyes. Might be the sheriff would see things different if he understood the full situation. Family obligations and all that. His meaning was clear. They were prepared to use violence if Jonas continued to resist their demands. From her position on the staircase, Eliza could see the deadly stillness that had settled over Jonas's frame. The way his breathing had become controlled and shallow in preparation for action. She had seen Uncle Silas's rages often enough to recognize the signs of impending violence. But there was something different about Jonas's readiness. Something disciplined and purposeful that spoke of training and experience rather than mere anger. Still, he was one man against three, and the odds were not in his favor regardless of his skill. Sarah, unable to bear the tension any longer, broke free from her sister's restraining hands and appeared at the top of the stairs where she could be seen from the yard below. "Uncle Silas," she called out, her young voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We don't want to come back. Jonas treats us good and kind, and we're happy here. Please just leave us be." The desperate plea in her words was heartbreaking, but it only seemed to increase Silas's determination to reclaim what he saw as his property. "You see what I mean about moral corruption," Silas said with theatrical dismay, gesturing towards Sarah as if her appearance proved his point. A young girl speaking out of turn, defying her natural guardian. This is what comes of letting children run wild without proper discipline. They forget their place and think they have opinions that matter. The casual cruelty of his words made Jonas's hand drift closer to his gun, though he maintained his outward calm. The second gunman, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers and scars on his knuckles that spoke of countless barroom brawls, leaned forward in his saddle and fixed Jonas with a measuring stare. "You know, McKenna," he said conversationally, "accidents happen all the time on isolated ranches like this. Fires start from lightning strikes, cattle stampede for no apparent reason. Good men get thrown from horses and break their necks. Would be a shame if something unfortunate happened to such a prosperous spread." The threat was as clear as a gunshot, and Jonas felt the familiar cold calm settle over him that had carried him through the worst battles of the war. He had killed men before when necessity demanded it, and he was prepared to do so again if these three pushed the situation beyond the point of peaceful resolution. But he was also aware that the sisters were watching and listening, and he did not want their new sense of safety to be shattered by witnessing the violence he might be forced to employ in their defense. Eliza appeared beside Sarah at the top of the stairs, her face pale but her voice steady as she spoke directly to her uncle for the first time since the auction. "You already sold us, Uncle Silas," she said with quiet dignity. "You took Jonas's money and signed the papers in front of witnesses. We're not your property anymore, and we're not going back to that life. If you try to force us, you'll be breaking the law yourself." Her words carried the authority of someone who had finally found the courage to stand up to a bully, and Jonas felt a surge of pride at her strength. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Silas pulled a crumpled paper from his coat pocket and waved it in the air with triumphant malice. "As it happens, I've got legal papers here that might change your perspective on this situation, McKenna," he announced with the smugness of a man who believed he held the winning hand. "Turns out those girls were never legally mine to sell in the first place. Their fathers left them in the care of their aunt in Kansas City, and she's been looking for them ever since they disappeared from my custody." Jonas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. If Silas was telling the truth, then the auction had been fraudulent from the beginning, and the sisters could be legally compelled to leave regardless of their wishes or his ability to protect them. But something in the man's manner suggested deception, the same oily confidence he had displayed when describing the girls as experienced household workers despite their obvious signs of mistreatment and malnutrition. From the staircase, Eliza felt her heart stop at her uncle's words. She remembered her father mentioning his sister Margaret, who had moved west after marrying a merchant. But there had been no communication between the families for years before their parents' death. The idea that this mysterious aunt might suddenly appear to claim them filled her with terror, for any relative of Silas was likely to share his cruel nature and mercenary instincts. "Let me see those papers," Jonas demanded, stepping down from the porch with his hand still resting on his gun belt. "If you're telling the truth, the documents will speak for themselves. But if you're running some kind of confidence game, Silas, you picked the wrong man to try it on." His voice carried the flat authority of his law enforcement experience, and for the first time since arriving, Silas seemed to lose some of his cocky assurance. The lean gunman shifted restlessly in his saddle, his dead eyes fixed on Jonas with the predatory focus of a snake preparing to strike. "Papers can say whatever a man wants them to say," he observed with cold amusement. Seems to me the important thing is what happens to those girls right now, today. Whether they come along peaceful-like, or whether we have to convince them that staying here ain't in their best interests. Sarah, despite her youth and the terror that gripped her heart, found the courage to speak up from her position beside her sisters. Even if there is an aunt somewhere, she called down to the men in the yard, that doesn't mean she's good to us. Uncle Silas promised to take care of us too, and look how that turned out. We were hungry and cold and scared every day we lived with him. At least here we're safe and fed and treated like human beings instead of burdens. The heavy-set gunman laughed with genuine amusement at Sarah's defiance. Listen to that little wildcat, he said to his companion. Got more fight in her than most grown men I've dealt with. Might be fun to break some of that spirit, teach her proper respect for her elders. The casual threat of violence against a child ignited something dangerous in Jonas's chest, and his hand moved fractionally closer to his weapon. Mary, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward beside her sisters with quiet determination. I've been working in the garden every day since we came here, she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the still air. Jonas's wife planted that garden with love, and it was dying from neglect until I brought it back to life. That garden is part of who I am now, part of what makes this place home. I won't leave it to die again just because some paper says I have to. Jonas felt something crack open in his chest at Mary's simple declaration. The way she had claimed ownership not just of the garden but of her place in their makeshift family. These girls had found belonging for the first time since their parents' death, and he would be damned if he let Silas or anyone else drag them back into the hell they had escaped. Whatever the legal complications, whatever risks he had to take, he would not abandon them to their fate. Silas seemed to sense the shift in the emotional current, the way the sisters' defiance had strengthened Jonas's resolve rather than weakening it. He folded the papers and returned them to his pocket with exaggerated care, his manner becoming more conciliatory as he realized that brute force might not achieve his desired result as easily as he had hoped. Now see here, Jonas, he said with false reasonableness. I'm not an unreasonable man. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone involved. Jonas stepped closer to Silas, close enough that the older man had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes, close enough that the menace in his voice would be unmistakable. The only arrangement I'm interested in, Silas, is the one where you and your friends ride off my property and never come back. The girls stay here and that's final. If you've got legal papers you think are worth something, take them to the sheriff in town and let him sort it out. But you won't be taking anyone from this ranch today. The moment stretched taut between them, filled with the potential for violence that could erupt at the slightest provocation. The sisters held their breath on the staircase, knowing that their future hung in the balance of this confrontation between the man who had given them sanctuary and the one who had made their young lives a misery. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising rain or perhaps snow before the day was through, and the wind carried the scent of approaching weather that would soon force decisions that could no longer be delayed. The storm clouds that had been gathering on the horizon finally opened with a vengeance, sending sheets of cold rain across the ranch yard and driving everyone toward shelter with the urgency of those who understood that prairie weather could turn deadly without warning. Silas and his remaining gunmen huddled miserably in their saddles, their earlier bravado dampened by both the downpour and the arrival of law enforcement that had shifted the balance of power decisively against them. Water dripped from the brim of Jonas's hat as he maintained his protective stance on the porch, his hand never straying far from his weapon despite the presence of Sheriff Bradley and his deputies. The thin man with the dead eyes made one final attempt to salvage something from the failed confrontation, his voice carrying above the sound of rain drumming against the roof and running in rivulets from the eaves. "This ain't over, McKenna," he called out with the impotent rage of someone who had been outmaneuvered and knew it. "There's more than one way to settle a dispute, and you can't watch your back every minute of every day." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, promising future trouble even as present danger receded. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward with the measured authority of a man who had heard such threats countless times before and knew exactly how to respond to them. "That sounds suspiciously like a promise of future violence, friend," he said with deceptive mildness. "The kind of promise that might earn a man a cell next to Silas here if he's not careful about his words. I'd suggest you reconsider whatever ideas you might be entertaining about revenge or retaliation, because my jurisdiction extends a lot farther than this ranch." Jonas felt the sister's presence behind him like a physical weight, Their fear and hope mingled in equal measure as they watched the final act of the drama that would determine their future. He could hear Sarah's quick breathing and sense Eliza's protective stance over her younger sisters, the way Mary pressed close to the wall as if trying to make herself invisible to the dangerous men who had come to drag them back into nightmare. Their terror strengthened his resolve even as it reminded him of the stakes involved in this confrontation. The gunman seemed to recognize that his position had become untenable, outnumbered by law enforcement and facing a rancher who had already proven his willingness to fight for what he considered his own. With a final curse that was lost in the sound of thunder rolling across the prairie, he spurred his horse away from the ranch buildings and disappeared into the gray curtain of rain, leaving only Silas to face the consequences of his fraudulent scheme and criminal ambitions. Silas himself seemed to shrink in his saddle as the reality of his situation became undeniably clear. The forged papers had been exposed, his hired muscle had fled, and he faced arrest and prosecution for crimes that could send him to territorial prison for years. His shoulders sagged with the weight of defeat, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, he looked like what he truly was. A weak man who had preyed upon those weaker than himself until he finally encountered someone stronger and more principled than his corrupt nature could overcome. Sheriff Bradley approached Silas with professional efficiency, pulling metal shackles from his belt with the practiced ease of long experience. "Silas Kendrick," he announced formally, "you're under arrest for fraud, attempted extortion, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt you'll exercise that privilege given your tendency toward conversation." The sisters watched from their position on the staircase as their tormentor was finally brought to account for his cruelty, hardly daring to believe that justice was actually being served. As Silas was led away in chains, his head bowed in defeat and his fine clothes already showing the effects of the rain that seemed to wash away his pretensions along with the dust of his arrival, Jonas felt something release in his chest that had been held tight since the moment he first saw the three sisters standing terrified on the auction platform. The external threat that had hung over their newfound happiness like a sword suspended by a thread had finally been removed by the firm hand of justice and the support of a community that had rallied to protect the innocent. The deputies mounted their horses with professional efficiency, their prisoner secured between them and their mission accomplished with the minimum of violence that marked good law enforcement. Sheriff Bradley paused before mounting his own horse, turning back to Jonas with the expression of a man who had seen enough injustice in his career to appreciate moments when right prevailed over might and the vulnerable found protection from those strong enough to provide it. "You did good here today, Jonas," the sheriff said, his voice carrying genuine respect and approval. "Those girls are lucky to have found someone willing to stand up for them when they couldn't stand up for themselves. Takes a special kind of man to see past circumstances to the people underneath, and an even rarer kind to put his own safety on the line for folks who aren't blood kin." The compliment meant more to Jonas than any official recognition could have, coming from someone whose judgment he trusted and whose opinion carried weight throughout the territory. As the sound of departing horses faded into the distance and the rain continued to wash the ranch yard clean of the morning's confrontation, Jonas turned back toward the house where three young women waited to learn whether their newfound security would endure or prove to be as fragile as morning mist. He found them still clustered together on the staircase, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief that their ordeal had finally ended without violence or separation. Sarah was the first to move, her natural resilience asserting itself as she processed the fact that Uncle Silas had been taken away in chains and would not be returning to threaten their peace. She launched herself down the stairs and into Jonas's arms with the boundless energy of childhood joy released from the constraints of fear, her small body trembling with emotion too large for words to contain. "He's really gone this time, isn't he, Jonas?" she whispered against his chest. "Gone for good and all, never coming back to hurt us or make us afraid." Jonas held her gently while Mary and Eliza joined them in the circle of safety that had become their sanctuary, feeling the weight of responsibility and the deeper weight of love that had grown between them through shared trials and mutual care. "He's gone, Sarah," he promised with the absolute certainty of someone who had seen justice served and knew it would endure. "And you're safe here for as long as you want to stay, all three of you, because this is your home now and no one has the right to take you away from where you belong." The simple declaration carried the force of sacred vow, sealing their bond as family chosen rather than born, united by love rather than law. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the deadly tension in the ranch yard like thunder rolling across the prairie, and all eyes turned toward the road where a cloud of dust announced the arrival of reinforcements for one side or the other. Jonas felt his heart sink as he counted at least 6 riders approaching at a hard gallop, fearing that Silas had arranged for additional gunmen to tip the odds in his favor. But as the riders drew closer, he recognized the familiar figure of Sheriff Tom Bradley in the lead, flanked by several of his deputies and 2 men Jonas knew to be respected ranchers from the surrounding area. Silas's confident expression faltered as he realized that the approaching lawmen were likely responding to reports of his presence rather than coming to support his cause. The lean gunman's hand drifted away from his weapon as he calculated the new odds, while his heavy-set companion began looking for escape routes that would allow them to withdraw without loss of face or life. The balance of power in the confrontation had shifted dramatically with the arrival of official law enforcement. Sheriff Bradley dismounted with the easy authority of a man who had spent 30 years keeping the peace in a territory where justice often came at the end of a gun barrel. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much violence and preferred to settle disputes with words when possible, but his hand rested comfortably on his weapon as he surveyed the tense scene before him. "Jonas," he said with a nod of greeting, "we got word in town that there might be trouble brewing out here." Jonas stepped forward to meet the sheriff, relief flooding through him at the sight of official support but careful not to let his guard down while Silas and his men remained armed and dangerous. "These gentlemen seem to think they have legal claim to the 3 sisters I purchased at auction last month," he explained, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone reporting facts rather than emotions. "They've brought some questionable documentation and made threats about what might happen if I don't cooperate with their demands." Sheriff Bradley's keen eyes swept over Silas and his companions, taking in their nervous postures and the quality of their weapons with the practiced assessment of a man who had learned to read trouble before it erupted into violence. "Silas Kendrick," he said with recognition that carried no warmth, "I heard you were back in the territory. Thought you might have learned your lesson about causing problems in my jurisdiction after that business with the card game last spring. As the sheriff takes control of the situation, I'm reminded of how crucial it is to have people in our lives who stand up for justice and protection. Whether you're watching this unfold during a quiet afternoon or perhaps late into the evening wherever you are, I hope you have those kinds of steady, reliable people in your corner. What part of the world are you experiencing this story from? And do you have someone like Sheriff Bradley in your community who stands between good people and those who would do them harm?" Silas straightened his shoulders and attempted to regain his earlier confidence, pulling the crumpled papers from his coat pocket once again. "Sheriff Bradley, I'm glad you're here to witness this. I have legal documentation proving that those girls were never mine to sell in the first place. Their fathers will place them in the custody of their aunt in Kansas City, and she's been searching for them ever since they disappeared from my care. This whole auction was a mistake that needs to be corrected." The sheriff accepted the papers with professional courtesy but subjected them to careful scrutiny, his experienced eyes noting details that would escape casual observation. After several minutes of examination, he looked up at Silas with an expression that mixed disappointment with grim satisfaction. "These documents are forgeries, Silas," he announced in a voice that carried across the ranch yard with unmistakable authority. "Poor quality ones at that. The legal language is wrong, the notary seal is from a county that doesn't exist, and the signature of this supposed aunt doesn't match the handwriting in the body of the document." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow, and his face went pale as he realized that his carefully constructed scheme had crumbled under professional examination. His 2 hired gunmen exchanged glances that spoke of men suddenly interested in distancing themselves from a client whose criminal activities had been exposed by law enforcement. The lean man with the dead eyes began edging his horse toward the road, while his heavy-set companion loosened his gun belt in a gesture of surrender. Jonas felt a surge of vindication mixed with protective anger as he realized the lengths to which Silas had been willing to go to reclaim the sisters who had finally found safety and belonging. The man had not only sold his nieces like livestock, but had then attempted to defraud the legal purchaser with forged documents and threats of violence. The pattern of manipulation and cruelty seemed to have no bottom, confirming every instinct Jonas had developed about the sisters' former guardian. From the staircase, the 3 sisters watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, hardly daring to believe that their nightmare might finally be ending. Eliza felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that the legal threat had been nothing more than another of her uncle's lies, while Mary gripped the banister with white knuckles as she processed the fact that her beloved garden would remain hers to tend. Sarah, despite her youth, understood enough to know that justice was being served at last. Sheriff Bradley stepped closer to Silas with the measured pace of a man delivering a judgment that had been long overdue. "Silas Kendrick," he said formally, "you're under arrest for fraud, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The charges will be filed with the territorial court, and you'll be held in custody until trial. As for your associates here, they have exactly 5 minutes to clear out of this county before I decide to charge them as accessories to your crimes. The heavy-set gunman needed no further encouragement, spurring his horse toward the road with the desperate urgency of a man fleeing certain imprisonment. His lean companion followed at a more measured pace, but with equal determination to put distance between himself and the consequences of Silas's criminal ambitions. Within moments, only the dust of their passage remained to mark their presence, leaving Silas alone to face the justice he had so long evaded through cunning and intimidation. The departure of Sheriff Bradley and his prisoner left an almost supernatural quiet settling over the McKenna ranch, as if the very air itself was exhaling after holding its breath through the long confrontation. Jonas stood in the ranch yard watching the dust settle from the departing horses, his shoulders gradually releasing the tension that had held them rigid throughout the ordeal. The sisters remained clustered at the top of the staircase, hardly daring to believe that the threat which had loomed over their newfound happiness had finally been removed by the firm hand of justice. Sarah was the first to break the spell of disbelief, her young legs carrying her down the stairs and across the kitchen with the boundless energy of childhood relief. She burst through the front door and launched herself into Jonas's arms with such force that he staggered backward, her small body trembling with the aftermath of fear and the overwhelming joy of safety confirmed. "He's really gone," she whispered against his chest, her voice muffled by the fabric of his shirt. "Uncle Silas can't hurt us anymore. Can he, Jonas? Can't make us go back to being hungry and scared all the time?" Jonas wrapped his arms around the child with infinite gentleness, feeling the fragility of her trust and the weight of responsibility it placed upon his shoulders. "He's gone for good, Sarah," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Sheriff Bradley will make sure he faces justice for what he did to you girls, and you'll never have to be afraid of him again. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be, and no one has the right to take you away from where you belong." Mary and Eliza joined them on the porch more slowly, their movements carrying the careful deliberation of those who had learned not to trust good fortune too quickly or completely. But as they stepped into the circle of Jonas's protective embrace, something that had been held tight and fearful in their hearts finally began to unfold like flowers opening to warm sunlight after a long and bitter winter. For the first time since their parents' death, they were truly safe, truly wanted, truly home. The weeks that followed brought a transformation to the ranch that went beyond the mere absence of external threat. The sisters threw themselves into their work with renewed energy, no longer laboring under the shadow of potential separation, but creating beauty and comfort for its own sake, and for the joy of contributing to a place that had become genuinely theirs. Mary's garden, freed from the specter of abandonment, bloomed with late autumn vegetables and carefully tended herbs that would sustain them through the coming winter months. Eliza discovered a gift for managing the household finances, her careful attention to detail and natural mathematical ability, helping Jonas streamline his business operations in ways that increased both efficiency and profit. She took pride in the neat columns of figures that tracked expenses and income, finding satisfaction in the concrete evidence that their family unit was not only emotionally successful but economically viable as well. The ranch prospered under her organizational skills in ways that surprised even Jonas with their scope and sophistication. Sarah's relationship with the livestock expanded beyond her beloved chickens to include the cattle and horses that formed the backbone of the ranch's prosperity. She possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed the hired hands and proved invaluable during the autumn roundup, when her ability to predict which way a spooked steer might bolt saved both time and potential injury. Jonas began to see in her the makings of a true rancher, someone who understood the land and its creatures with an instinct that could not be taught. As the first snows of winter began to dust the prairie with crystalline beauty, I find myself thinking about how home is not just a place but a feeling of belonging and safety. Whether you're listening to this story while winter approaches in your part of the world, or perhaps experiencing the warmth of summer where you are, there's something universal about that moment when we finally find our tribe, our chosen family. What time is it in your corner of the world right now? And do you have that sense of belonging that these sisters have finally discovered? The legal resolution of Silas's fraudulent claims brought unexpected developments that further secured the sisters' position in their new life. Sheriff Bradley's investigation revealed that their father had indeed left them in the care of his sister Margaret. But when contacted, the woman expressed nothing but relief that they had found a good home and formally relinquished any claim to their custody. She had searched for them after hearing of Silas's neglectful treatment, but had feared they might have perished from exposure or malnutrition during the harsh months following their parents' death. Jonas found himself facing a choice he had not anticipated when he first intervened at the auction that seemed so long ago. The sisters were legally free now, able to make their own decisions about their future without the threat of forced separation or return to abusive circumstances. They could stay on the ranch as hired help, they could seek positions elsewhere, or they could remain as the family they had all come to treasure. The decision, he realized, had to be theirs to make freely and without coercion. On a crisp December evening, as they gathered around the kitchen table for the evening meal that had become their sacred time of connection, Jonas broached the subject that had been weighing on his heart. "You girls know that you're free now," he began carefully, his weathered hands clasped together as he searched for words adequate to the magnitude of what he wanted to say. "Free to go wherever you choose, do whatever you think will make you happiest. You don't owe me anything, and you don't have to stay here out of gratitude or obligation." Eliza looked at her sisters and saw her own feelings reflected in their faces, the certainty that had grown quietly but steadily over the months of healing and belonging they had shared. "We know we're free, Jonas," she said softly, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained them through their darkest hours. "That's exactly why we want to stay. Not because we have to, but because this is where we choose to be. You gave us more than shelter and safety. You gave us the chance to become who we were meant to be, and we want to spend our lives showing you how grateful we are for that gift." The simple declaration hung in the air between them like a benediction, sealing the bond that had grown from desperation and charity into something deeper and more enduring than blood or legal obligation. They were a family by choice rather than circumstance, united not by shared history, but by shared commitment to creating a future worthy of the love they had discovered in each other's company. 5 years later, the McKenna Ranch had become something remarkable that drew visitors from across the territory who came to witness what many called a miracle of transformation and prosperity. What Jonas had built for 3 frightened sisters sold at auction had indeed made history, though not in the way any of them might have imagined on that dust-filled September morning when desperation and compassion had collided in the town square to change 4 lives forever. Eliza, now 24 and radiant with the confidence that comes from knowing one's true worth, had become Jonas's full partner in running the ranch operations. Her natural gift for organization and figures had expanded their cattle business into the most profitable spread in 3 counties, while her gentle authority with the hired hands had earned respect throughout the territory. She wore a simple gold band on her left hand now, having married Jonas in a quiet ceremony the previous spring that had been witnessed by half the territory and celebrated for days afterward. Mary had transformed the neglected garden into something that resembled a botanical paradise, her artistic vision creating beauty that served practical purposes as well. She supplied vegetables and herbs not only to their own table but to restaurants and hotels throughout the region, her reputation for quality and innovation making the McKenna name synonymous with agricultural excellence. At 21, she had received 3 marriage proposals from neighboring ranchers, but she preferred to focus on her calling as a teacher at the small schoolhouse that Jonas had built on their property for the children of their workers. Sarah, now 19 and possessed of the kind of spirit that could gentle the wildest bronco or charm the most difficult cattle buyer, had developed into one of the finest horsewomen in the territory. Her intuitive understanding of livestock had made her Jonas's right hand during roundups and cattle drives, earning the grudging respect of cowboys twice her age who had initially dismissed her as a mere girl playing at ranch work. She had fallen in love with the son of a neighboring rancher, a young man whose gentle nature and deep respect for her abilities promised a partnership as strong as the one her sister had found with Jonas. The story of what had happened at the McKenna Ranch had spread far beyond the boundaries of their county, becoming the stuff of legend among those who believed in the power of human kindness to transform impossible circumstances into miraculous outcomes. Visitors came from as far away as Chicago and San Francisco to see the ranch where 3 orphan sisters had been given not just shelter, but the opportunity to become the remarkable women they had always possessed the potential to be. As I bring this story to a close, I'm struck by how it speaks to something eternal about the human capacity for healing and growth when we're given genuine love and belonging. Whether you've been with us through morning sunlight or evening shadows wherever you are in the world, whether it's been a quiet moment of solitude or time shared with loved ones, thank you for journeying with these characters as they found their way home to each other. The house itself had grown to accommodate their expanding family, with Jonas adding rooms and wings as needed to shelter not only his adopted sisters but also the families of his most trusted workers and the steady stream of visitors who came seeking to understand how such transformation had been possible. The original auction had been intended to dispose of 3 burdens, but it had instead created a community that would endure for generations and serve as a model for others facing similar challenges. Local newspapers had written articles about the McKenna Ranch experiment, as some called it, documenting how providing safety and opportunity to those society had discarded could yield benefits that extended far beyond the immediate recipients of such kindness. Politicians and social reformers pointed to their success as evidence that investing in human potential, even in its most damaged and unpromising forms, could produce returns that enriched entire communities. But for Jonas and his sisters, the true measure of their success was not found in newspaper articles or visiting dignitaries or increased profits, though all of those things brought satisfaction in their own way. The real victory was in the quiet moments they shared around the kitchen table each evening, the easy laughter that filled rooms once heavy with loneliness and grief, the sense of belonging that had healed wounds that had once seemed too deep for any medicine to reach. On winter evenings when snow covered the prairie and the wind howled around the eaves of their sturdy house, they would gather by the fire as they had on that first night when Sarah had broken the plate and Jonas had shared the story of his sister Rebecca. Now Mary's pressed flower memorial to Rebecca held a place of honor on the mantelpiece, surrounded by photographs of their growing family and mementos of achievements that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days under Uncle Silas's cruel authority. Sarah had found the carved wooden horse that Jonas's wife had treasured, and she had learned to carve similar figures that she gave as gifts to the children who attended Mary's school. Each small sculpture carried forward the tradition of creating beauty from simple materials, of finding ways to express love through the work of careful hands, guided by generous hearts. The children treasured these gifts not only for their craftsmanship, but for the story they represented of transformation and hope. The legacy of what Jonas had built for 3 sisters sold by their cruel uncle would endure long after their own lifetimes had ended, inspiring others to look beyond surface appearances and temporary circumstances to see the potential that existed in every human heart. Their story became part of the folklore of the territory, passed down through generations as evidence that choosing compassion over convenience, that extending protection to the vulnerable rather than exploiting their weakness, could create ripples of positive change that would spread far beyond what any single act of kindness might seem to warrant. As the years turned into decades and their hair grew gray and their hands grew weathered by honest work and the passage of time, Jonas and his sisters would look back on that September morning in the town square as the moment when their real lives had begun, when for broken hearts had found the courage to reach across the gulf of fear and loneliness to create something whole and beautiful and enduring that would stand as testimony to the transformative power of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and family over blood.